Okay, gird your loins. We are about to get into section 89, which is the word of wisdom. And there's a lot of people who have a lot of feelings about the word of wisdom. And what does it mean? And how is it done? And so, unless I'm mistaken, and I've been reviewing all the Joseph Smith papers as I've gone through it, I think this might have the largest, especially for its size, but the largest historical introduction and set of footnotes. It is crazy how much detail we're going to get into this. So I am giving this section its own part because it is just, people get upset when you tell them you can't drink or drink tea or coffee. And where's soft drinks and where's refined flour and sugar? La, la, la. There's so many things in this. So I'm going to give it to you straight out of the Joseph Smith papers. You can do whatever you like with it. But wow, there was so much extra research done into this. And I think for good reason. This is probably, whether you're a member of the church or not, this is just a really charged revelation for a lot of people. And, people get upset if you tell them what they can and can't eat. What can I say? Kosher law for Mormons, if you wish, but very interesting. And I also noticed something about that, speaking of kosher, that I thought was interesting. I'll get to that in a second. Anyway, so let's get into the word of wisdom. This is section 89. The earliest copy of this, when you know it, even though they're not getting along right now, is actually out of Sidney Gilbert's notebook. This guy in Independence who's getting these nasty letters every once in a while and chiding him for his negativity and all that kind of stuff. That's what he's got. So anyway, and it's in the handwriting of Sidney Gilbert. That is the very first earliest copy that we found. And that's based on language used and all that kind of stuff. We also get a copy in Revelation Book 2, which is Frederick G. Williams' handwriting, a very clean copy. Not really a whole lot of changes there, which is why we think Sidney Gilbert might have an earlier copy of it. The original is lost to us. There's also a copy in Revelation Book 1, which is actually in the handwriting of Oliver Cowdery this time. So he sort of takes over the seat. John Whitmer is off doing other things apparently, but Oliver Cowdery is actually the one that writes this in Revelation Book 1, which again, if you've forgotten, Revelation Book 1 and 2 are what they use to publish Revelation. So the Revelation Book 1 was the Book of Commandments, and a lot of other things that didn't show up in the Book of Commandments, and the 1835 Doctrine and Covenants, the very first Doctrine and Covenants that we ever get. So Revelation Book 1 and 2 were used to print those books. We also get a loose paper found in what's called the Abbott Family Collection. This is the handwriting of a woman by the name of Anne Marsh Abbott. All right, and what I wanted to do is give you a biography of Anne Marsh Abbott. What's so special about her? She has a copy of this Revelation that's on a loose paper that's kind of been beat up a little bit. So I went to the Joseph Smith Papers website, and they said, we have not compiled a biography for this woman. Okay. So then I went to the Church History Libraries collection, and they say, well, and this is from the first 50 years of the Relief Society, which I believe I'm pointing to right here. It's one of those books. The Church Historians Press also did the first 50 years of the Relief Society. And it basically says she was born here. She died here in Salt Lake City. She moved in 1847 with the Saints. That's all you get. I've looked elsewhere. There's really nothing there. So the best thing I can do for you is this. This is her gravestone in Salt Lake City. And so she was a part of this. She got a copy of this Revelation and wrote it down in her own hand. And that's all that I was able to get. So I'm very sorry, Anne. That's all that we could find from the Abbott family. We also get a copy of this Revelation in a broadsheet. And if this looks familiar to you, this is the same broadsheet as section 88. And the bottom portion of it is actually section 89 as we have it now, which is the Word of Wisdom. And it shows up in the 1833 Book of Commandments. And you might say, Mr. Amateur Historian, that can't be because that whole thing went kaput before they could print it. And you're right. This is actually in the handwriting of Wilford Woodruff. There were some extra pages in the back of his copy of the Book of Commandments. And Brother Wilford, later President Woodruff, actually wrote it with his own hand in the back of the Book of Commandments. So I thought that was really interesting. He actually added his own section here. It's kind of fun. This one shows up in Mormonism Unveiled. Been a long time since we talked about you, bro. But yeah, Mormonism Unveiled. So this is an anti-Mormon book. And it just calls it another revelation. And it's accurate. I have to give that to them. I mean, as anti-Mormon as they might have been, they actually had a lot of really good information. So, take that as you will. It is called Section 80 in the 1835 Doctrine and Covenants. The very first version of this is Section 80. And we get a copy in the manuscript history of the church. So it made its rounds. As far as we know, not in the Evening and Morning Star, which I found very interesting. And you might see why in just a second. So, what are the circumstances surrounding this? Well, the earliest copy simply gives us what is called, quote, a word of wisdom. Now, word of wisdom used to be well, for the most part, it is associated with a spiritual gift. You have the gift of wisdom or the word of wisdom. But modern culture of the church has sort of changed the word of wisdom into basically a health code. That's what we have nicknamed it, because at the beginning it calls it a word of wisdom. Revelation book 2 says, a revelation for the benefit of the saints, etc. Revelation book 1 adds the date of when this was given and says, a revelation for the benefit of the saints, given in Kirtland, February 27th, 1833. Anne's copy gives the same. There's nothing on the broadsheet, and nothing in Wilford Woodruff's copy, and really nothing besides another revelation in Mormonism Unveiled. So not a whole lot of introductions to this. The original Doctrine and Covenants is interesting because it says, a word of wisdom for the benefit of the Council of High Priests, assembled in Kirtland and Church, and also the saints in Zion, to be sent greeting, not by commandment or constraint, but by revelation and the word of wisdom, showing forth the order and will of God in the temporal salvation of all saints in the last days, given for a principle with promise, adapted to the capacity of the weak and the weakest of all saints, who are or shall be called saints. All of that is italicized, and that actually is now just inside of the revelation, but I thought I might mention, because usually the Doctrine and Covenants doesn't give us anything. It actually gives us quite a lot here. The manuscript history goes into some of the conference minutes of the previous and then says, February 27, 1833, I received the following. And then you get the word of wisdom, revelation. All right, modern section headings leave out the very last statements about Joseph-inspired introduction, okay? And it says this. So from 1981, the differences that we get here is it says, as a consequence of the early brethren using tobacco in their meetings, the prophet was led to ponder upon the matter. Consequently, he inquired of the Lord concerning it. This revelation, known as the word of wisdom, was the result. The first 3 verses were originally written as an inspired introduction and description by the prophet, which I believe is why they're italicized in the Book of Mormon. The 2013 edition says all the same things, but it leaves out this whole sentence. So the first 3 verses were originally written and inspired, blah, 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 is all not in the current Doctrine and Covenants. So that is one of the changes. For some reason, the church decided to leave all of that out. All right. So the historical introduction, holy cow, has way too much to say about this. So the Joseph Smith Papers editors, I think, kind of know the cultural importance of the word of wisdom to Latter-day Saints and to anybody who knows anything about the church today. So, wow, bear with me. But there's a lot of good stuff in here. So, and I've cut out some things here because it's a lot. Yeah, here we go. It says this. While no contemporaneous sources describing the circumstances under which Joseph Smith dictated this 27 February 1833 revelation have been located, later accounts indicate that it was recorded in connection with the activities of the School of the Prophets. According to Brigham Young, heavy tobacco use in the form of both smoking and chewing among members of the school, combined with Emma Smith's and others' complaints about cleaning tobacco juice from the floor, led Joseph Smith, quote, to inquire of the Lord with regard to use of tobacco, unquote, and to the conduct of the elders with this particular practice. This revelation, composed largely of warnings and counsel regarding not only the use of tobacco, but also the consumption of various foods, hot drinks, wine, and strong drinks, was the result of his inquiries. So, what you can imply from this is this whole idea of, led Joseph Smith to inquire of the Lord regarding the use of tobacco. As far as we can tell, those are actually the words of Brigham Young and not anybody else. Footnote 1 to this says, Young did not attend the School of the Prophets when this revelation was recorded, but stated he received this information from those who were there. According to Young, tobacco juice was often spit all over the floor of the room in which the school met, and, quote, the smoke was so dense You could hardly see across the room. But he wasn't there. So here's where we get into some stuff. But yeah, he wasn't there. And so this whole story about him and Emma and all that kind of stuff was actually just a story that Brigham told, and he wasn't actually in the room, but he heard it from others. So again, take that as you want. All right. Further into the historical introduction, the temperance movement was actually starting to become popular. So we get this. At the time this revelation was dictated, the temperance movement, as well as other dietary reform movements, was beginning to factor more prominently in American culture. Initially fueled by concerns about the psychological effects of alcohol, calls for more moderate or temperate use of alcohol, and even for complete abstinence, had become increasingly identified with Christian reform movements by this time, and had resulted in the formation of thousands of temperance societies throughout the United States. In Kirtland, Ohio, the Kirtland Temperance Society, whose founding constitution boasted 239 signatories, held its first annual meeting on 6th of October, 1830, shortly before Mormon missionaries arrived in the area from New York. The society continued for 5 years, during which time a distillery at Kirtland and 2 in Mentor, Ohio, eventually closed for want of patronage. According to one reminiscent account, the society disbanded after many of the temperance workers moved away as the Mormon population in the area grew, suggesting that Mormon involvement with the society was limited. So I find it kind of funny, like, we don't want to do any drinking or whatever, and the Mormons show up and they're like, I'm going to get out of here. I don't want to live here anymore. But before then, they were already doing this sort of abstinence from alcohol and shut down the brewery and the distillery. So I thought that was very, very interesting. And I will also mention, if you remember our history, and I hope you do, because that's what we're doing here, is filling in the history, Alexander Campbell was a big part of this temperate movement, or this abstinence from alcohol. So this is, to me, yet another Campbellite teaching that I feel has been, in some maybe big or small way, an influence on, the teachings of the church. So again, Campbellites, just to review, they believed in 3 degrees of glory. They believed in sort of this idea of do not consume alcohol. So we have a lot to thank these people for. I think they were on a really good track to do some really good things. Anyway, further into the historical introduction we get. Among the members of the Church of Christ, there was apparently some question as to what the revelation meant by hot drinks. Prompting Joseph Smith and Hiram Smith, according to one reminiscent account, to explicitly identify coffee and tea at a meeting in Kirtland in July of 1833, so a few months later, as the hot drinks prohibited by Revelation. Similarly, opinions on how strictly the Revelation's instructions were to be followed appear to have differed among church members. Nothing changes much, does it? Anyway, probably as a result of the Revelation's opening statement that the word of wisdom was given, quote, for the benefit of church members, not by commandment or constraint, possibly complicating the situation where the different ways this statement was presented. With one possible exception, the earliest manuscript versions of this revelation present the opening statement as part of the revelation, as do the printed broadsheet and How's Mormonism Unveiled. In the 1835 edition of the Doctrine and Covenants, so again, that's 2 years later, however, the opening paragraph appears as an italicized heading, allowing for the later interpretation that it was an introductory statement rather than part of the revelation proper, and that therefore it was Joseph Smith or one of his scribes, not God, who said the revelation was not a commandment. So why did the 1981 version say that was an inspired thing and then 2013 took it away? It seems like that debate is still happening. Was this a commandment by revelation, that it was to be a commandment, or not a commandment, or, anyway. We're still doing that to this day. I find that funny. Footnote 15 to what I just read was, Hiram Smith made the same point 9 years later in Nauvoo. In 1870, Brigham Young also identified the hot drinks mentioned in the Revelation as tea and coffee. And this is still a debate to this day. So I will leave that to you, but this is still a thing. And is the opening statement mean, this is just more of a suggestion of health, not really a commandment? Was that inspired or not? It's a debate to this day. So I just find that interesting. But this goes back all the way to the very beginning when this was received. Historical introduction a little further says, in any event, the degree to which church members felt obligated to follow the Revelation's instructions varied. Some, like Zebedee Coltrane, Joel Johnson, and John Tanner, chose to abstain from coffee, tea, and tobacco and alcohol almost immediately. Footnote 17 is a famous story that you may have heard about this before. It says, in October 1883, Coltrane reported that those present in the School of the Prophets when Joseph Smith first read the Revelation, quote, immediately threw their tobacco and pipes into the fire, and that while, quote, those who gave up using tobacco eased off on licorice root, interesting, there was no easing off on tea and coffee. These they had to give up straight. Discussing the same topic a few months later in 1883, Coltrane reported that members of the school, quote, all laid aside their pipes in use of tobacco, and that he had never used it since. Johnson, who was present when the Revelation was first presented and who, quote, had used tobacco smoke and chewed 15 years and always used strong drink, tea, and coffee, laid them all aside, unquote. After hearing the Revelation, Tanner similarly discarded the use of tea, coffee, and spirituous liquors after hearing about the Revelation in New York in late 1833 or early 1834. So to this day, people have a different thing. But I guess if you want to get over your tobacco problems, licorice root apparently is a good alternative, or it will help you. I've never heard of that remedy before. That's from the 1800s. But yeah, people reminiscing on this many, many decades later were describing this. Okay, more from the historical introduction. Many church members, for instance, apparently felt that it was acceptable for tea or alcohol to be taken medicinally. Emma may have offered tea and coffee to new arrivals with this idea in mind. Joseph Smith's administering whiskey in June of 1834 to George A. Smith, who was suffering from cholera, almost certainly reflected such an interpretation. In spite of Joseph Smith's acquiescence with this practice, not everyone agreed with it. On the 4th of December, 1836, for example, at the instigation of Sidney Rigdon, a meeting of church members in Kirtland voted unanimously to discontinuance the use entirely of all liquors from the church in sickness and in health. Over the ensuing years, nevertheless, various church members, including Joseph Smith, continued to allow for the use of these drinks in cases of sickness. So, footnote 22 for this says, the two exceptions Rigdon allowed were, quote, wine at the sacraments and external washing. I'll get to that one in a moment, which is kind of fun. Footnote 23 for this says, Oliver Cowdery, for example, justified his drinking tea 3 times a day during the winter of 1837 and 1838 on grounds that he was sick. Leaving Nauvoo, Illinois, in ill health in the fall of 1839, Brigham Young and others availed themselves of tea and, quote, tonic bitters, which church members had prepared for them because of their sickness. While it is unclear how closely Joseph Smith intended Nauvoo city ordinances to correspond to his understanding of church standards, it may be significant that as a city councilman, he voted for an ordinance prohibiting the sale of liquor in less quantity than a quart, excepting on the recommendation of a physician duly accredited in writing. So if you have a prescription, you can get yourself some of that stuff, some of that good stuff. All right. So those are some footnotes from that. So further into the historical introduction we get, by the Nauvoo era, Joseph Smith was more frequently making exceptions to the general observance of the word of wisdom that were not linked with health issues, hardship, or sacred functions, possibly indicating a more relaxed attitude on his part towards things like tea and wine. Joseph Smith's journal from March 11 of 1843, for example, indicates that he, quote, had tea with his breakfast, unquote. 2 months later, on the 3rd of May, 1843, Joseph Smith, quote, drank a glass of wine with Sister Richards of her mother's make in England, unquote. A year after that, Joseph Smith, quote, drank a glass of beer at Mosier's, which is Frederick Mosier's, unquote. So, yeah. Take that as you will. Footnote 31 to this says, during the Nauvoo period, other church leaders appear to have shared Joseph Smith's views on drinking these beverages. In a meeting of the Quorum of the 12 and High Priests on the 7th of November, 1841, Brigham Young stated that he would not be violating the word of wisdom if he went home and drank a cup of tea. At present, according to Wilford Woodruff, quote, concluded that it was wisdom to deal with all such matters according to the wisdom which God gave, and that a forced abstinence was akin to bondage, unquote. Okay. Like I said, lots in this. Further into the historical introduction, like I said, there's a lot here. At least in regard to alcohol, Joseph Smith inveighed against drunkenness rather than just occasional consumption, which reflected his own actions in relation to alcohol. He informed the men that, quote, we should never indulge our appetites to injure our influence, or wound the feelings of friends, or cause the Spirit of the Lord to leave us. There is no excuse for any man to drink and get drunk in the church of Christ, to gratify any appetite or lust contrary to the principles of righteousness, unquote. So before y'all head off and say, hey, he had a glass of beer, he says, you do not get drunk. And just as it is today, we seem to focus on the drinking part of this. So from the historical introduction we get, though the revelation instructed that meat was, quote, to be used sparingly, church members appear to have placed very little emphasis on that counsel, like we do today, perhaps because this portion was rarely referenced by church leaders. Journals, reminiscences, and other personal records of the time that discuss specific provisions of the word of wisdom generally focus on the use of hot drinks, strong drinks, and tobacco, rather than on the misuse or overuse of meat. The same is true of more official records and statements. In a noteworthy exception, Hiram Smith, in an 1842 discourse on the word of wisdom, urged the saints in Nauvoo to attend to the revelation's instructions regarding the use of meat, to be, quote, sparing of the life of animals, unquote. So there's a portion in the word of wisdom that kind of says, like, don't just go killing things for the sake of killing them. Like, be judicious, eat it sparingly, or in times of famine. So what are the punishments to this, if any? And this is part of the issue even to this day. It says here, quote, following a meeting that had been held in Pennsylvania in which some of the members of the church refused to partake of the sacrament because the elder administering it did not observe the words of wisdom to obey them. Rather than addressing the Pennsylvanians' refusal, the Curlin High Council deliberated on the more fundamental issue of, quote, whether disobedience to the word of wisdom was a transgression sufficient to deprive an official member from holding an office in the church after having it sufficiently taught him, unquote. The official decision presented by Joseph Smith and sanctioned by the council was that, quote, no official member of this church is worthy to hold an office after having the word of wisdom properly taught to him, and he, the official member, neglecting to comply with or obey them, unquote. So there you go. You shouldn't be holding an office if you're violating this rule, according to that particular conference. Footnote 44 to this says, during the Nauvoo period, other church leaders appear to have shared Joseph Smith's views on drinking these beverages. In a meeting of the Quorum of the 12 and High Priests on the 7th of November, 1841, Brigham Young stated that he would not be violating the word of wisdom if he went home and drank a cup of tea. All present, according to Wilford Woodruff, quote, concluded that it was wisdom to deal with all such matters according to the wisdom which God gave, unquote, and that a forced abstinence was akin to bondage, as I have already read. So that's where that comes from. Footnote 48 for this says, according to the rough draft notes of Joseph Smith's history, the men were ordained, quote, with this express injunction that they quit the use of tobacco and keep the word of wisdom, unquote. So I believe that this is still a thing today. Before you are ordained to anything, you are taken in, you are given an interview, and you are asked if you keep the word of wisdom. And if people have a question about that, we are to explain to them what that means. So before baptism, before an ordination to the priesthood, before getting your patriarchal blessing, before going to the temple or getting married or any of those kind of things, they're going to ask you a word of wisdom question. And I believe that kind of, we can justify by coming back to this. Okay, so that's all for the introduction, which is quite a lot. Again, there's some going back and forth here, which I think holds true to this day. So what's in this thing? Most of the footnotes that we get are actually wording comparisons between the various versions of this section. So like, oh, Revelation book 2 says this, but Gilbert's notebook says that. And I am not going to go through those because I think that's going to be too difficult to describe or hold interest on. So I'm going to forbear with all that. But I am going to go through a few that are worth noting. First of all, I wanted to give a summary of what the word of wisdom is. So for those of you who may not know what this even is, or if you haven't read it in a while, one, it is to say wine or strong drink, which is the wording, tobacco and hot drinks are prohibited. They actually have other uses, and we'll get to that in a second, but like tobacco can be for bruises and sick cattle. And apparently you can use strong drink to wash your body with, which we'll get to that in a second, and hot drinks, which had to be interpreted later as coffee and tea. So there you go. Herbs in their season and fruits are good and best in their season. Animal flesh was to be used sparingly. Grain is good for man and beast. And then it says wheat for the man, corn for the ox, oats for the horse, rye for the fowls and swine, and for mild drinks. And you get a promise of a healthy body. And, a famous sort of quote here, you can run and not be weary, and walk and not faint, those kinds of things. So that's what's actually in it. So let's go through this. So let's talk about the alcohol thing first. It says in the Revelation, quote, "Inasmuch as any man drinketh wine or strong drink among you, behold, it is not good, neither meet in the sight of your Father, only in assembling yourselves in your sacraments before him. And behold, this should be wine of your own make. And again, strong drinks are not for the belly, but for the washing of your bodies," unquote. Raise your hand if you've washed your body with whiskey. Okay. You can put that in the comments. Footnote 8 is the great source note, and it's very funny to me. It says, strong drink probably refers to distilled drinks like whiskey and rum, which had an average alcohol content of 45%. Wine and other fermented drinks like hard cider and beer had significantly lower alcohol content, ranging from about 5% for beer to around 18% for wine. Somebody in the Joseph Smith Papers department really put a lot of thought into alcohol content here, so I thought that was fun. Footnote 11, let's talk about washing with whiskey here. Distilled drinks like whiskey were used topically to treat wounds and other injuries at the time, and I think still are. The extent to which they were used as a body wash is less clear, though Joseph Smith and others washed themselves with whiskey on at least one occasion in January of 1836 in order to, quote, "be clean before the Lord for the Sabbath," unquote. Now, if I washed myself with whiskey and walked into church, that might be a different experience, but there you go. Joseph Smith washed himself with whiskey once before going into church so that he can be actually clean before he went to the Sabbath that day. Now, I would also mention, once again, Joseph Smith never lived in a day where there were chapels. Never once. Chapels are a thing that went well into the Utah era. So this is just meeting outside or maybe in somebody's house. Anyway, let's talk about the tobacco thing now. The Revelation says, quote, "Tobacco is not good for man, but is for bruises and all sick cattle, to be used with judgment and skill." Footnote 12 to this says, instead of "and tobacco is not for man," the Revelation Book 2 copy reads, "And again, tobacco is not for the body, neither for the belly, and is not good for man," unquote, which is what you have today. Footnote 14 for this also says, in addition to being smoked, chewed, and used in snuff, tobacco had been used for centuries as a cure and preventative for scores of diseases, injuries, and conditions. Its use to treat bruises, for instance, dates back to at least 1633. By 1833, however, a growing number of physicians, educators, and clergy were questioning its medicinal use and effectiveness. And by 1860, most physicians had eliminated it from their pharmacopoeia. Tobacco was also used extensively to treat a variety of maladies in cattle, sheep, swine, and horses. Users were cautioned to use it carefully, however, as its effect could be lethal, even in topical applications. So you can kill your cattle with too much of this. And I may also add, thank you to the Joseph Smith Papers, pharmacopoeia, like a cornucopia, is probably my new favorite word, a pharmacopoeia. I don't believe I have a pharmacopoeia. I don't really take a lot of stuff. But anyway, there's the word of the day, pharmacopoeia. Let's talk about the coffee and tea thing. Revelation says, and again, hot drinks are not for the belly, for the body or belly. Footnote 15 for this says, Several other early 19th century authors argued that any liquid taken at a high temperature could cause injury. So perhaps that is why we use the term hot drinks, or why that was used at the time. So there you go. Now let's talk about famine and sparingly and all that having to do with eating meat. So, quote, flesh also of beasts and of fowls, I the Lord hath ordained for the use of man with thanksgiving. Nevertheless, they are to be used sparingly, and it is pleasing unto me that they should not be used only in times of winter or of famine. So basically, if you don't have anything else to eat, yes, you can go kill a deer and eat it. Footnote 20 for this says, many other contemporary authors similarly argued that meat was better for humans in the winter than in the summer. Thomas Tryon, for example, advised that meat be eaten sparingly and especially avoided in the summer. So they used to attach seasons to foods, which we still do. So I think it's kind of fun. Now let's talk about mild or barley drinks. This is part of it. It says, barley for all useful animals and for mild drinks, as also other grains. Now, if you know anything about brewing, other grains, barley, hops, potato juices, we might call it, a lot of, corn, a lot of these things can be used to distill drinks, right? So this has been used as a justification for some. Footnote 29 says to this, mild drinks could include barley water, a non-alcoholic drink made by the decoction of pearl barley and used as a remedy for a variety of conditions, or drinks made from malted barley. So that's what that means. Now, I think an interpretation of this used to be postum. I don't even know if that's still a thing, but I know that some people call that a milder barley drink. And then you get the big promise at the end. So we've gone through a lot of the things. So the big promise that we get at the end is, all saints who remember to keep and do these sayings, walking in obedience to the commandments, shall receive health in their navel and marrow to their bones, and shall find wisdom and great treasures of wisdom and knowledge, even hidden treasures, and shall run and not be weary, and walk and not faint. And I the Lord give unto them a promise, that the destroying angels shall pass by them, as they did by the children of Israel, and not slay them. Okay. Footnote 32 for this says, instead of, quote, great treasures of wisdom and knowledge, the Revelation Book 2 copy reads, quote, wisdom and great treasure of knowledge, which is how we get that. And that's it. You might notice there was something missing here. There was an amen added to the end of Revelation Book 2. So there's no amens in the earlier copies of this. Okay, that is a awful lot to talk about. We're up to 30 minutes of this, talking about the word of wisdom. But yeah, a lot of different interpretations. Was the commandment or not a commandment, inspired or not? These are all things that happened way back in 1833, 4, 5, during Joseph Smith's lifetime, and was still talked about well into what I would like to call the Journal of Discourses area, where you get into 1860s, 70s, and 80s. And to this day, it's still a thing. So that's what we get from the Joseph Smith papers on the word of wisdom. Now, I'm sure there's other things, but like I said, we are constraining ourselves just to that to fill in this history. In our next section, we're going to be talking about a few more published revelations that we have. So stick around for part 3.